Hey there. You got yourself a new TID radio, you got yourself a TD-H3, and you heard a little bit about the NIC firmware and you want to put it on your radio. This video is for you. I'm going to walk through some of the things about this firmware and how to use it on this radio. Starting from the very beginning, I'm not going to go over all of the features, but I'm hopefully going to go over enough to get you started. The first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to go to the walkietalkiesoftware.com website to gather the TID radio software used for your radio. Once you get here, you're going to want to go to the login and click register. They will send you a code to your email address. You'll then use that to activate your account. Come back here and log in. Once you're logged in, make sure you go to the software section. Make sure you've got yourself a programming cable. You can use an FTDI cable or you can use a CH340 cable. The radio itself has a built-in CH340 chipset, and I'm just using a standard USB-C cable for that. So that's plugged in right here. You can get the other type of cable that uses the K port and plugs in normally where your speaker mic would plug into your radio. From there, you're going to scroll down on this screen. You're going to find your radio. I currently have the TD-H3 Ham edition. That's where I'm going to click. I will then scroll down, find the blue download button, and download their software. That'll be a zip file that contains the programming software as well as a power tuning software. And then in another zip file within there is the firmware programmer, where you can update your firmware to the latest stock edition. Now, we're going to go over those three softwares so you kind of have an idea of what they look like and how to use them. The first thing we want to do though is we want to go into Device Manager on our computer, and we want to verify that our USB cable is connected and it shows the chipset. Mine's the CH340, and I want to see which COM port it's assigned to. Mine's assigned to COM port 3, and we'll need to remember that for the different software that we're using. Opening up the first bit of software, this is the programming software for the radio that comes from TidRadio. You can come up here and click COM. You might have more than one COM part listed, but make sure that you select the one that's associated with your radio. Click OK, and then we're going to read from the radio. We're going to click read again, and this is going to grab the channel information, and well, I guess that's not going to work unless we turn our radio on. So let's turn the radio on and try that again. We're going to click read, and now we're getting our progress bar. That's going to get all of our channels that have been saved. That's going to get any of the settings that have been saved in the radio. And in our case, we're actually attempting to save the default configuration that comes from the factory so we can use it later. So once we've got that downloaded to our software here, we can click save and we can save it. I've already saved mine to this code plug file, and that's good enough for me. I did that just a minute ago. I'm now going to close out of this software, and I'm going to come to this software. This is the power tuning software. We're going to again make sure our COM port is selected correctly. We're going to click read and then read again. We're going to get some gibberish in this little pop-up box. We can disregard that, click close. And now you should have information that's been populated from your radio to this software. This is how your radio came configured to display the power output on your screen. And then on the right hand side here, this is some frequency tuning that's been done from the factory for your specific radio. Each of these radios might be tuned a little bit different, so you'll want to save this file as well. I saved mine as power tuning, and that way if I ever need to go back to stock, I can re-import these two files, the code plug and the power tuning files, and put them back on the radio. For your radio, you're going to want to focus on this line that starts with the 140 through 150 and see that the transmit center column, the transmit frequency is set to 130 for the power level. Down lower, when you get to the 440 to 450, you're going to see that's also set to 130. Your radio might have different settings here. If you want to calibrate your radio to match as closely as possible to the way it came from the factory, you can grab these values from here, and we'll use those later in the NIC firmware programmer that was made by Marcus Dudley. Oh yeah, I didn't mention this is Marcus Dudley's software and firmware that we are playing with. This is not mine. This was created by Marcus Dudley. He is actively working on this virtually every single day, and it keeps changing, but he's to a really stable release right now, and I finally decided it was time to share some of this information with you guys, and hopefully it won't go outdated really quickly. Okay, so we've got this file that we just created along with that code plug file. We want to make sure that we put those somewhere safe. Those together are what you would call, I guess, your code plug that you can restore back to later on. The last piece of software is for flashing the firmware updates. Now we can flash the latest firmware from TidRadio by clicking open here and choosing that firmware file right here. But actually you can also go and grab the latest NIC firmware, the custom firmware by Marcus Dudley, and you can load that to your radio with this program as well, and it works just fine. If you ever need to go back to stock, it's not a bad idea to gather this EEPROM.wipe file that you can download from the Facebook group. And it's also linked in a document that I created for you that I call the user manual. This document, I'll put a link to this and some of the other information to Marcus's website in the description of this video. But I can tell you right now, I've put a lot of work into getting this document as complete as possible for the latest release. I am currently definitely going to recommend that you run version 2.07.06, possibly higher, as it'll probably change soon. But this one is a really stable release, and it might be worth trying out. If you're watching this and this release is gone, good luck. But I'm pretty sure you'll be fine because it's pretty stable at this point. But there's so much information in this document, you should definitely read through this. This first page, it'll just tell you where to get some of that information from the Facebook groups and from Marcus's website. The third page is the getting started section, and it'll walk you through a lot of the things that you need to know on using this radio with this custom firmware. This firmware is not plug and play. You cannot just load it to your radio and expect it to work right out of the box. There's definitely some configuration and some calibration that you need to do right at the very beginning. So we'll talk about those in just a minute. Let's go to Marcus's website, and we're going to grab from the dev build section of his website. We're going to grab version 2. I have actually already downloaded it, but you click the download V2 button here. That'll give you the version 2 of the software, or sorry, the firmware. The programmer is the software he created, and you can download that, and that'll give you a zip file. Once you've got that, you can extract it from the zip file, and inside you'll have a 64-bit version and a 32-bit version of the program. I'm going to run the 64-bit. The first time you run this program, it'll probably alert you that, hey, this hasn't been signed by a known developer, and so Microsoft will just warn you. It's up to you if you want to proceed. I think it's safe, so I went ahead and proceeded. But the other thing that it's going to do, it's going to prompt you to download and install, I believe it's a .NET framework or runtime. Sorry, it's a .NET runtime that you need to install on your computer to be able to use this programmer. So get that installed, then come back and run this programmer. Okay, let me expand this into a better position for you to see everything, and we'll start talking through it a little bit. To get started, you can actually use this flash button down here to, when you click it, you can identify the version of firmware you want to load to your radio. This is the one that I just downloaded. It's a .bin file. It's the NIC firmware for the H3 radio, and it's version 2.07.06. So I can select this here and click open, and now this program is ready to write to the radio. I'm going to cancel that by clicking the little red X at the bottom, and I'm going to show you another way. In a web browser such as Google Chrome, after you've downloaded it, you can click the firmware flasher tool, and you can also do the same thing from here. You can click choose file, select the firmware that you want to install. You're going to select your serial port. In this case, sometimes when I switch back and forth between the programmer and a web browser, I just have to reconnect the USB cable to the radio, and it'll show up. So I'm going to click the COM3 and click connect, and click flash firmware. Now the process for doing this is you actually just turn off your radio, you hold in the push to talk button, and I think you can do it with either one of them, and then turn your radio back on, and you can let go of that push to talk button, and we're off to the races. It is flashing the new firmware to the radio. There are some steps that we have to take right after doing this though. Let me slide this up so you can see a little bit better what is on the screen. I'll do my best to keep this angled in a way that the camera will pick up the screen well, but it's a little bit tricky, so I might go out of focus. It might get a bit of a glare, but I'll do my best for you. Okay, first thing you're going to notice is on the screen, it's showing an output power of 8.5 watts in the bottom left-hand corner of VFO-A and VFO-B. So that's not accurate, not even close to accurate. You're also going to see that it defaults to a frequency of 144. Maybe that's what you're going to use. Maybe it's not, probably not. But we need to do some basic initialization to this radio. We don't even want to start programming anything on the radio itself by pressing the keypad, but we actually want to go back and use Marcus's nicFirmware programmer. Looks like I have two of them open. The first thing, when you open this programmer, it's supposed to default to the default code plug that comes shipped with the programmer. But if you ever aren't sure if you've got it, just click the load button in the bottom left-hand corner, go into the same folder as the programmer, and then grab this default.nfw file. Click open, and it's going to load the programmer with that default information. The very first thing you need to do is you need to write this to your radio. So click write. And if you don't get a red progress bar, you could be doing the same issue as me. I just switched from my web browser and back to the NIC programmer, and I need to disconnect and reconnect my USB cable for some reason. Maybe that's unique to my computer. I don't know. I'm going to click write again. And there we go. We're writing the configuration to the radio. The pre-configuration comes with GMRS radio frequencies set, as well as some other ones, and some other configuration things, but it's important that you do this step because your radio will not be ready to use until at bare minimum you've done this. There is definitely still more that needs to be done, so let's talk through some of those things. The basic band plan that Marcus has set up here will work. You might want to adjust which frequencies are listed here. These are the frequency ranges that you'll be able to transmit on. This bottom one actually is the catch-all. It's going to show you all of the frequencies you can actually set on this radio, all the way down to 18 megahertz and all the way up to 1.3 gigahertz. Do not try to transmit outside of the normal GMRS and ham band frequencies. If you try to transmit outside of these, there is a good chance you are going to damage this radio. This radio is not designed to transmit outside of the normal ham and GMRS frequencies. If you're concerned about that, you can actually come in here and you can select the lower frequency ranges. Say, for example, I wanted to set mine from 18 all the way up to, 137. And say, I don't want to transmit on any of these frequencies. So I could come in here and I could actually change this modulation option to enforce none. Now when I load this back to the radio, I won't be able to enter a value of 18. Let me show you on the radio. I'm in VFO-A right now, and if I just type in 18 and then I hit the pound key, that's going to accept a value of 18. Now I'm going to write this code plug, the information in the programmer, to the radio by clicking the write button, and it should have that little bit of information I just added on line 18 in the radio now. So now if I try to type in 18 and hit the pound key, it won't accept it. So that's a good way to disable certain frequencies you're not planning to use. A little bit more about the band plan. Let's look at the drop-down menu under modulation. You can leave it to ignore. It's going to not use that section of the band plan, I believe, if it's set to ignore. But ultimately, if a particular channel on your radio doesn't have a configuration that tells it to use FM, AM, or USB, it will default back to using the one that's listed in your band plan. So if the setting on the radio for modulation is set to auto, then this is the modulation it's going to use. It's going to use FM if I set it to FM right here. If I set it to enforce FM or AM or upper sideband, then enforcing it means it will take precedence over what you have configured in the channel on your radio for the modulation. Your radio is only going to transmit on FM. It will receive on AM and it will receive on the upper sideband, but as far as I know, you don't transmit on AM at all, and I'm pretty sure you can't transmit on the upper sideband function as well. The bandwidth, you can set that to narrow or wide, and again, if you don't have it preset on the configuration in the menu of the radio, it'll default to what you have set here if the frequency falls within the ranges here. And these work kind of from the top down. If it matches the first row here, then that's what it'll use. If it doesn't match that, it'll use the next one. If it doesn't match that, it'll use the next one. It'll go all the way down until it finally hits the last row. The comments over here are just for reference in the programmer. Those don't get saved to the radio. Okay, so there's some basics about your band plan. Line 5 is the frequencies used by the radio to listen to the broadcast FM. There's a separate chip in the radio that they use to decode or demodulate that traffic, and it is set to the FM tuner. If you don't have that in your band plan when you write to your radio, you won't be able to use the FM tuner to listen to broadcast radio. Now we're going to go over to the tuning tab. The tuning tab actually uses values similar to what we saw in the program that comes for the power tuning from TidRadio that we looked at earlier. When we grabbed some of those values, they were set to 130 on my radio. On your radio, they might be different. So I'm just going to set this one to 130 on VHF peak power, and then again down here on the UHF 130. To find the actual peak wattage of your radio, you're actually going to need to get a power meter and connect it to your radio and test on different frequencies and adjust your power setting in the radio up or down and transmit and see what your power meter tells you that it's set to. This curve on this graph here is a best estimate, but it's not perfect. It's not going to give you a perfect value. And so what the screen on your radio shows in the bottom left-hand corner of each of the VFOs, it'll have, currently on my screen, it's red, and it shows a value of 0.0 watts on the VFO A. We'll bump that up here in a minute. But I'm just going to leave these where they're at now. To get these really fine-tuned as best as possible, you're going to need a power meter attached to your radio to be able to determine that, I guess, the reading of wattage on the screen of your radio is at least close to what it's actually outputting. If you set this to go up to 7, 8, or 9 watts, don't expect your radio to really do that. And honestly, there's a small chance that it might even try to overpower some of the circuitry in your radio and cause some damage. Some people have kind of indicated that's theoretically possible. Some have indicated that the settings in this programmer right here are really just to try to calibrate what the reading is on your screen, but they don't actually allow the radio to transmit at a higher output power. More or less, you can, from whatever your radio's maximum output power is, you can adjust it down all the way to 0 to where then it's ultimately not going to transmit at all. And so you can really lower the output power of your radio, which is helpful. So I got this set, and I'm just going to write this to my radio right now. And then we're going to actually adjust the power setting on the radio by going into the menu and we'll adjust it for VFO A. So if I go into the menu by hitting the blue button, and I think it's menu 3. So this is our transmit power. Goodness, I don't know if you can see that very well on the screen. If you can't, let me see if I can make any adjustments. I am not sure what adjustments to make in the software I'm using. Hopefully you can see it well enough. Maybe like that. We've got a transmit power of 1 currently, and that's not going to put out really any power. So we're going to hit the menu button again and edit this, and I'm going to bump it up to say 127. That's close to the 130, but not 100%. We're going to hit the blue button again to save that, and then we're going to exit out of that. Oh, the reason we're not getting any power output on this one is because this is in a frequency range we set not to be able to do a higher power. So let's go to a frequency of 146, and then we'll push the star key for a period. We'll hit the pound key to save that, And now you can see it just jumped up to 4.9 watts on the screen. That 4.9 watts indicates close to maybe what this radio is capable of doing, but it's probably not going to be perfectly accurate. If we go back into the menu and look at the power setting, it's showing 127 is the value. Again, I set in the programmer 130 as being the maximum value, which if I put that in, would bump the wattage up to 5. This is good enough for me right now. Okay, coming over here to the settings tab, we have a whole bunch of settings in here that correlate to the settings in the menu on the radio. You can read them from the radio into the programmer with this button, or you can write them from the programmer to the radio. Now, here's a tip about writing information to your radio, especially if you have multiple of these radios that you plan to use. The tuning tab is going to be specific to each radio, and you don't want to use one set of settings, including the tuning section, to push that out or write it to each of your radios, because you might overwrite the tuning that was specific to a certain radio. So once you get each of your radios calibrated, you can come down here to the right section, or the right button at the bottom, and instead of just clicking it, you can right click. Now you can send the settings from the programmer, or you can send the tuning from the programmer to the radio. Once you get your tunings all right, I would suggest you just send the settings to the radio, and that way you can avoid overwriting the tuning settings. It's a good idea to back up the code plug with the save button down here to however you want this set up for future use. In case you set anything incorrectly or can't figure out how to get it back to the way you like it, all you have to do is come in here, load your old code plug, and then write it to the radio. Group labels. This radio has the ability to assign groups to your channels. We'll go over that in a minute and then come back to this. You have DTMF presets, so you can set sequences of tones, options 0 through 18, and then there's a 19th one here that's used for the push to talk ID. There's a remote function, so if you want to see what's on your screen of your radio right on the computer, you can do that here. You can actually activate the menu and change settings. We're going to go out of that. You've got your scan presets, so these are frequency ranges as well as additional scan settings that you can configure that will be associated with those frequency ranges. And then you can open this up on a menu of the radio and easily scan certain sets of frequencies, which is quite convenient. Activity Scanner is a feature for you to be able to, instead of scanning and then having the radio stop and broadcast certain audio from a signal for you to listen to, it will actually scan, and every little frequency that it picks up that's strong enough, it won't let you listen to on the radio, but it'll record it here in the programmer. So that's something that you can read about in the manual if you'd like to learn how to do that. Skinning. Skinning is where you can customize the layout of the screen on your radio. You can also customize the colors of the different values on the screen, and you can also customize the buttons and what they do when you long press each of the keys on the keypad. You can save these by exporting the long press values to a CSV file and then later import them back into the programmer. You can export the skinning values, which is all of these presets over here on the left. You can, aside from the position of everything, you can save all of the colors as part of that exported skin. Once you import the skins you want and the long press button values you want, or customize it each time you come in here, however you want to do it, you then click the Save Firmware button. Now to get started, I should have pointed out you click the Load button. You have to actually load the firmware file for it to even display the default configuration. You can see what it looks like when you're receiving a signal on your radio, when you're transmitting, when you're scanning, when you have it set to a single push-to-talk mode, what your menu looks like. If you leave the menu button checked, you can then see what it's like when you've selected a menu option, when you're inputting a value, and you can adjust these colors using the stuff at the bottom here as well. With everything turned off, you can now see what the scope looks like. You can actually use the scope to find signals over a broader spectrum visually on the screen, which may or may not be interesting to you. But ultimately, you can do a whole lot to customize the way the layout and feel of this radio is by adjusting things here. And then you save that new .bin file, the new firmware file, and then you'll use the flash option down here to flash that new firmware file to your radio. When you do that, it does not overwrite all of the settings and tuning and channels that you've already saved to your radio. So it's kind of nice when you want to update to a newer version, or you maybe just want to change the layout of your screen. You're not going to overwrite all of your settings when you flash the firmware. Okay, looking at the channels tab. In the channels tab, you can activate individual lines. You can give it a name, a receive frequency. Your receive frequency can be the same as your transmit frequency, or you can set a different transmit frequency by typing in a value, and your radio will display the transmit frequency right below the receive frequency. We'll actually, I guess, go into the radio itself and we'll show you how to enter a transmit frequency. So in VFO-A, we're in VFO mode. We're not in channel mode or group mode. We'll cycle through those by hitting the orange button. Now we're in channel mode. We're on channel 198. If we hit it again, we're going to go into group mode. Group mode is a collection of a set of channels that have been saved, but they've been marked with a group letter. So this one's been marked with group letter G, and group letter G is one of the channel options for a group. The firmware allows you to have 15 different groups. They're groups A through O in the alphabet, and each channel can be assigned to up to 4 group letters. So channel 1 here is only assigned to group G, but it could be assigned to 3 more groups if I wanted it to be. The group name on the top left here is GMRS, and you can assign that in the programmer under the group labels. So we can see group G right here is GMRS, and that group label will show up on the radio. Going back to the channels tab, I guess we're going to go back to the radio for a second here. We can long press when we're in the VFO mode. Actually, we can do it in channel mode and other modes, but I don't want to mess up my channels right now, so I'm just going to work in VFO-A. If I long press the orange button, now we can actually enter in a transmit frequency that will be different from our receive frequency. I can put a 146.5, and then I'll hit the pound key to end. And then you'll see there's a little up arrow next to that transmit frequency, meaning that it is a value higher than our receive frequency. It would point down if it was a value lower than our receive frequency. If we want to get rid of that transmit frequency, we can long press the orange value or the orange button, and then we can press the flashlight key on the left side of the radio below both of the push to talk buttons. If we do that, that'll just clear the transmit frequency from the VFO. Let's put a frequency back in there. Now that we have that transmit frequency in there, we can actually reverse the frequencies that are in there and make our transmit the receive and the receive the transmit frequencies if we long press 5. That also, right above our power indicator of watts, we see a red R on the screen. That red R indicates that we have reversed our frequencies. That's really just a flag and an indicator, and it can actually be removed. We'll go into that a little bit later when we talk more about all of the different long press options for each of the keys. For now, I'm just going to long press 5 to switch my frequencies back. Going back to the programmer, looking at line 8 for GMRS channel 8, we've got our frequencies. We are not currently using subtones, but I can tell you right now, one of the things that we have not talked about that is very important for initially setting up and calibrating your radio is a feature that we call XTAL. So we're going to go out of these screens and we're going to go back to the document that I've created. I would recommend that you go to the Getting Started section on page 4, option 8, and have a look at that and read about the XTAL 671 option on the radio. This is a calibration that needs to be done for your radio, and it will be unique, just like the power output reading. It will be unique to your radio. They are not all the same. There's some videos on how to do this linked in this document. And you can also go down to menu option 23, listed currently on page 14 of the manual, and it'll describe how to find your XTAL value. So I'm going to go into my radio right now, and I'm going to go to menu option 23, and I'm going to set mine, even though I don't know exactly what it is and I have not actually calculated this yet. I know that a lot of these radios by default are going to be close to 34, but I could be wrong. So I won't leave it like this, but just for demonstration purposes, let's pretend that I went through the calibration methods that are shown in the videos linked in the document, and I found my XTAL value, and I set it correctly, and I saved it in my radio. This is going to line up the transmit and receive frequencies so that they're more accurate for the radio and the chip that's inside this radio. If you don't do this, and then you go and try to use a repeater, there's a really good possibility that when the radio transmits a CTCS code, or you receive that, sorry, it's a tone, not a code. You've got the DCS, that's the other one, DCS code, or the CTCSS tone. If those values are set in your radio to work with a repeater, you may not be able to open the repeater by transmitting, and you may not be able to have your radio receive the response from the repeater as well. So getting that XTAL 671 value on menu 23 set correctly is really important for your radio to function correctly. All right, going back to the programmer. We're going to set our transmit power on our different channels. These values will correlate to the way you set up the tuning tab, so you're going to have to correlate that. But again, what displays on your screen may not be perfectly accurate, so you're going to have to fine tune and play with that using a power meter with your radio and testing on different frequencies and adjusting your power from 0 to whatever you set your maximum, and ultimately try to get it to a value that displays close to what's really being output from your radio. The group section right here is where you can enter in up to 4 letters that correspond to the different groups that you want this channel to be in. Currently, we have all of the GMRS simplex channels 1 through 22 set to the value of G. Then we have the GMRS repeaters, which are repeaters 15 through 22 frequencies. They have an H next to those as well. So they'll still show up in group G, but these ones specifically for repeaters will only show up in group H. You can set the bandwidth to wide or narrow. You can set the modulation from FM or AM or upper sideband, but just know that when you set this value here, if it's left to auto, it's going to use whatever you set in your band plan. So again, going back to your band plan here, you can see what you have these set to. If you want this here to override what's on an individual channel, then you're going to have to set this to the enforce option. And then you can set the busy lockout on some of these so that if you have somebody trying to transmit, then you can lock out and not transmit back. I believe you cannot use this if you have a transmit value set in your radio for a repeater. I think this might only be for simplex. I can't remember. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Maybe you can't use it. There's a certain thing. Read the manual. It's in the manual. The reverse option here is just where this will be checked if you read from the radio. So for example, I'm going to go back to my radio. I'm going to long press number 5, and I'm going to reverse my frequencies. Now I'm going to read from the radio, and oh, that's not going to help because I'm not in channel mode. I'm actually doing this on VFO-A, which is not very helpful because it doesn't actually display in the programmer right now. The next version, it'll actually display clear down at the bottom. Marcus has added to the next version that's not out yet. Channel, I guess 199 and 200 are going to be listed as VFO-A and VFO-B, and those will represent the information that's in your VFO mode on your radio. Right now we're in channel mode, so let's go to channel mode by hitting the orange button. We're going to go to channel 23, which is a repeater. You type in the value of the channel and hit the pound key. Don't hit 0 first, that won't work. That key's been reassigned for another purpose. So if you're just trying to go to a channel, either type in the single digit, the 2-digit, or the 3-digit value and hit pound, and it'll take you there. Okay, so we're on the GMRS repeater, and there's a transmit and a receive frequency listed. We're going to reverse these with the 5 key again. And we're getting some transmission, but we're going to read from the radio. And when we read from the radio, we're going to see this check mark on line 23 right here is now checked. If we wanted to write that back to the radio unchecked, we could just uncheck it and write it to the radio. And you're going to see that the radio is going to remove that little R flag indicating that the frequencies are switched. Now the R flag is gone, but technically the frequencies are still flipped. So we're going to flip it back. And here's a secret. You don't need to use the programmer. We're going to shift temporarily to a second set of long press keypad options. By long pressing the menu key, the blue key, this no longer enables Bluetooth, but this shifts all of the keys to a different set of values for long pressing. We can actually see an indicator that turned into what almost looks like a chevron or a little house icon. That's indicating that it's been shifted to the second bank of long press keys. And now key number 5 will remove that flag after we've reversed the frequencies. Then I'm going to actually, while we're in that second bank of long press options, we're going to long press 1, and that will turn off Bluetooth. Now we're going to long press the menu key to go back to the first bank of long press options so that we can run through all of the long press options in a minute. Okay, I think that's pretty much everything that we needed to set up. You can set up your push to talk ID and set it to on, or I guess it'll transmit at the beginning of a transmission, the end of a transmission, or both, depending on how you set it. But there's how you set up your individual channels for your radio. Group labels, we talked about adding labels to your groups so they'll display on your screen. DTMF codes, if you need to use these for linking repeaters or opening a patch system, you can preset values in here and you can access them on your radio when you are in. Let's do that. Let's just add a value. We're going to just, on value line 1, we're going to put in maybe a star, and we're going to type in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's it. We're going to write that to the radio. And once that's on the radio, we'll be able to access this preset menu. As long as we're in the first bank of long press options, I'm going to actually get off of this GMRS frequency. It looks like there's some traffic. We're going to long press, actually we're going to go into VFO mode first. VFO A, we're going to long press the pound key. And now we're going to get our presets for DTMF. And in my case, I only have one. If I press the push to talk button on the side and transmit, it will send those codes, or sorry, those tones automatically. Now let's say you don't have a preset of DTMF codes. You can long press 2 on the keypad, and you can now type it in, and then press the push to talk button, and it'll send your DTMF code. To exit out of this, push the flashlight key, which is the bottom key below both of the push to talk buttons, and that will exit out of that menu. Looks like my Bluetooth came back on. That's unusual. I'm going to turn that back off. Oh, it's because I wrote the radio with settings that had it turned on. Okay, if I were to read the radio now, it will remember that my Bluetooth was turned off in the programmer. Okay, so we've seen 2 different ways. The presets with DTMF by long pressing the hash key or pound key while we're in VFO mode. We can long press the 2 key. That will allow us to type in on the keypad the DTMF tones we want to send, and then we push a push to talk button. The next thing we can do is we can actually just hold down the push to talk button, and then while holding it, dial the DTMF code that we want to dial in, and it'll send those tones over the transmission. All right, next thing that we want to go over. The radio is by default in a mode called push to talk dual. That means that there's 2 VFOs, and there's two push to talk buttons. And if you push the top one, it will transmit on VFO A or whatever channel is in VFO A. If you push the bottom one, it'll transmit on the bottom one, and it'll auto switch back and forth to whichever VFO is active. Now let's go into the menu. I think it's 13. Yep, nope, that's dual watch. I cannot remember now. I think it's higher. Let's find the PTT mode. I think it's above. Oh, there it was. Menu 15. So we can change this mode to single and save it. And now we have whichever VFO is active is what's displayed on the screen. To switch between the two, we push the pound key or the A/B key to switch to VFO B or VFO A. And if we push either push to talk button, it will transmit on that frequency. The next option is, instead of single, we can go to hybrid. Hybrid will still display both of the VFOs on the screen, but whichever one is active, currently it's VFO A or the top one, either push to talk button we use will transmit on that VFO. If we want to monitor both VFOs, we can long press 9 to turn on dual watch. That was the actual menu option 13. We'll go in and look at that. You can turn it on or off right here in the menu, or you can just use the long press shortcut of 9 on the radio. So my dual watch is on. I've got an icon that says A/B. Now there's another function that we can lock it to one of the VFOs. Unlike most radios, by default, when you turn on dual watch, anytime a transmission comes in on the radio on either VFO, the radio will auto switch to making that VFO active. Therefore, if you go to transmit and you have it set in either hybrid or single mode, both of the buttons will transmit on whichever VFO is active, and that may not be the one you intend. So there's a way to lock it to either VFO A or VFO B when in dual watch mode. We have to shift to our second bank of long shift options. Once we've shifted and we see that little chevron icon, we can long press 0. This will only work if you're in dual or hybrid push to talk mode. If you're not and you're still in the dual push to talk mode, this lock mode won't work. But if we long press 0 now in the shifted long press options, that just changed our AB icon to a capital A, meaning VFO A at the top of the screen is our active VFO. We can switch that to B, and our icon changed to a B, indicating that it's on B. Now, if we transmit with either push to talk button, it will transmit on the VFO that we locked it to, even if the last transmission came in on the other VFO. So that way you can make sure your communication stays with the party you want it to be with, even if you're trying to dual monitor both frequencies. One last feature to go with this is if we go into the menu and we go into menu option 54, Marcus added recently this dual watch delay. The dual watch delay is how many seconds after you have transmitted on a particular VFO before it will go back to listening to both frequencies. That way you can have some time to listen to the response traffic on the VFO you last transmitted on. Currently mine's set to 30 seconds, but you might want to lower that down to 5 or 10 seconds before dual watch turns back on. I'm going to turn dual watch off, but I'm actually going to leave the lock feature on. For me, that's preferred. So I'm going to shift back to bank 1 of the long press options by long pressing the blue menu button. And then I can use the 9 key to turn that dual watch off. The lock function that we turned on is still on, so the next time we turn dual watch on, it's still locked to whichever bank we last activated. We can switch that again with the pound key. So I'll turn dual watch back off. And going back to the computer, I want to focus here for a second. Let's get these out of the way. Focus on the fact that there is a lot of information in this manual I created. And if you go down past all of the menu options, you're going to be able to see the long press key actions. You're going to learn some things that are really important. Number 1, with the programmer, you can reassign these values. And if we go to the programmer and go to the skinning tab, the way you do that is you actually can come in here. The dark long shift options are the standard options, and then the red ones are when you shift to the second bank. If you want to change what one of these buttons does, you can right click on it and you will get an options list that you can select the option you want for that key. Then you have to save it to a new firmware file, and then you have to flash it to your radio to get those updated configurations. This one's really important though. If you change the key that's used for locking the radio, you need to make sure that you set it the same on both your standard long shift bank, or not long shift, sorry, long pressed bank, and the shifted long pressed bank. Make sure it's the same key. By default, it's the star key. That's the one I would leave it on if it were me, because that one's the one that has the little key icon on it. But if you don't keep that particular function on both banks, you can definitely lock yourself out of your radio and have to end up reflashing the firmware to your radio. Okay, going back to this document, this shows you in bold which values are different in the non-shifted long press bank and the shifted long press bank. Some of them are the same, some of them are different, but you're going to want to jump in here and make sure that you're looking at that. It looks like I have messed this up somehow, and I'm going to have to fix this so that these are lined up again, because they are not lined up currently. I'll get that corrected on the next release of this document. Okay, I'm going to run through all of these long shift options and what they do. So starting on the left side here, we're going to look at the radio. If we are in channel mode or group mode, we can change the name of the channel by long pressing the 1 key. We can use the keypad now to enter in values, and we can shift up or down to move left or right, and we can ultimately get the name that we want to be saved in here, and then we can hit the blue key to save it. I'm just going to hit the orange key to exit out of this mode. The number 2 key was to be able to manually enter in a DTMF code, or tone I should say. Key 3 is to start a scan. In channel mode, it will scan all of your channels. If we are in the group mode and we start scanning, it will scan only the channels that are within the currently selected group. If you want to switch which group it's scanning while it's scanning, for example, we're going to start scanning the GMRS group by long pressing 3, and now we can actually shift up a group or down a group with the star key and the 0 key. Whenever it stops on a frequency and starts listening to that frequency, you can actually hit the pound key to exclude that frequency from your current scan. The next time you end the scan and then start a new scan, it will reset the frequencies that have been excluded. So you can also come into the programmer and you can read the radio, and may not work while we're listening to a frequency. Let's try reading again. There we go. We're reading from the radio. Then we're going to go to the Scan Presets tab. And if we've excluded any frequencies from our scan, they should show up right here in the top right hand. So that might help you to identify frequencies that you want to exclude in your band plan, or maybe potentially remove from your groups. Okay. The next thing is the star key locks the keypad if you long press it. The 4 key will open up the preset scanned lists. I've got a pre-scan list already in here, and I can select it. If you have more than one pre-scan list in here and you want to listen to more than one of your presets, you can mark it with the star key. That'll put a little icon next to the name showing that that one's going to be one of the presets that's scanned. I can then go to another one and push the star key. And now if I hit the blue key and start scanning, it'll scan all of the presets that I've marked. So that can be handy to listening to or scanning more than one preset at a time. The 5 key was for reversing our transmit frequency and our receive frequency. The 6 key, if we long press that, that will actually shift a certain, basically we get a bit of an interference from the display of the radio itself on certain frequencies. Due to the signal bar at the top of the screen that's updating so rapidly, if you find that you've got kind of a helicopter sound in the background of a transmission you're listening to, you can always try to long press 6 and it should shift that interference to a different set of frequencies temporarily. And then when you're done, you can turn that back off and it'll shift it back. Long pressing 0 in VFO mode will allow you to enter in a frequency. Same thing with channel mode. This is where you set your receive frequency, is by long pressing 0. Long pressing 7 will do the frequency counter. If we were to send another signal from a different radio nearby that's really strong in a frequency such as 2 meters or 70 centimeters, this will lock onto that really quickly, and you'll be able to then save this to your current VFO for being able to transmit. So it's a good way to really quickly grab a frequency, and this is actually really useful when configuring your XTAL 671 value on menu 23. Long pressing 8 will go into the broadcast FM. So if you wanted to listen to the local radio stations, you can turn that on, or you can just type in a frequency that would be within that range, and it will automatically turn on the chip that's used for demodulating the broadcast FM. Long pressing 9 is how we enter the dual watch mode to monitor both VFO A and B at the same time. And then long pressing the pound key is how we got into the DTMF presets. Okay, we're going to hit the exit. We're going to long press the menu button to shift our long press values. Now all of our keys have a second option, and by default some of them are the same and some of them are different. So going back to looking at the manual, the lock for the VFO while using dual watch was key 0. The turning on and off Bluetooth is key 1. Activating the scope, you can only do this in VFO mode, and it will automatically switch you to I think dual mode on the push to talk. I think that's required for this to function correctly. Or no, what it does is it takes you out of the single mode. You can't be in the single mode for it to function. So we're going to long press 2 while in VFO mode, and now we're monitoring a set of frequencies. The frequencies displayed at the top of the screen, the left one is the lower end of the frequencies displayed on the screen. The right frequency is the upper end, and then the more bold frequency in the middle is the frequency that is the strongest displayed on the screen at a given time. If you see a really strong frequency coming in somewhere on the screen and you want to center it to that frequency, press the pound or hash key and it'll center it on that frequency. Your step size that's set in your menu is how fast it goes up or down. So if we press up, it's going to shift the frequencies that it's listening to by the step size that you have configured in the radio. Using the star key and the 0 key will do 10 times the step value up or down. So you can swing up and down the spectrum as you're monitoring the scope. Now the scope will, when it's active, will not allow you to hear any transmissions, but the center of the scope, whatever frequency that's on, if it happens to be an active transmission, when you exit the scope, that is actually going to be the frequency that it stays on when you're in VFO mode, and you'll be able to transmit on that frequency. So that's something that can be useful if you want to interact with that frequency, or if you just want to listen to that frequency, you have to exit the scope. Key number 5, again, when you're in the shifted long pressed mode, that's how you remove the reverse flag. And then key 7, 8, and 9 are just shortcuts for changing from dual to single to hybrid push to talk mode. So those are some of the long press keys and how to use those. There's a lot of other information on how to use specific things in the programmer and how to primarily do things on your radio. I highly recommend you go through the manual, look at how you do some of these things and change modes and configure things from the radio, because it is really helpful and it is really useful to know how to do this stuff in the field without having the programmer and software available. You can clone the settings of this radio to another radio right from the radio. That's something that's built into the menu. I'm not going to take the time to go through all of the menu options. There are a lot. You've got your squelch as menu 00, and you've got 54 options in here. But all of them are described in detail in the manual. So go read through the manual, see what they do. And then if you still have questions, you can get on the Facebook group for Marcus Dudley's Nic Firmware. There's a support group where you can ask questions. There's the development group that's really focused on just development purposes, such as reporting bugs and maybe requesting a feature enhancement. But if you're just having difficulties using your radio, you definitely want to ask those questions in the support group. I think that's it for now. Hopefully this video helps you to see how to use your radio. If you get to the point where you're like, hey, this isn't for me anymore, then in the files download sections of the support group on Facebook, you can download a very specific file called an EEPROM wipe. And what you'll do is you will open that file, EEPROM_wipe.bin. You're going to do that in this program that's used for flashing firmware updates to the radio. We're going to turn our radio off. We're going to hit the start button. We're going to hold the push to talk button, and we're going to turn the radio on, and we're going to flash that EEPROM wipe file to the radio. You're going to see the radio go through a few screens here indicating that it's wiping the radio. And when it's complete, it'll tell you that it's complete, and then you can turn your radio back off. At this point, your radio will not be usable. There, the wipe is complete. We'll turn it off. We're now going to select the latest firmware from TidRadio, and we're going to start flashing this firmware. And it looked like that one failed, and it's wiping again. So we'll let that finish. I must not have held the push to talk button quite soon enough when I powered on the radio. Okay, turn the radio back off. We'll click end. We'll double check that we have the right file selected. Now we're going to hit start. We're going to hold the push to talk button, turn on our radio, and there we go. Now we're flashing the firmware to the radio again. This is the stock firmware. Now we're not done yet. We want to go all the way back to stock. So we are going to now open the power tuning application. We're going to open the file that we saved and backed up. And we're going to write this to the radio. Serial port says invalid. So I'm going to reseat my USB cable. And I'm going to make sure that it's set correctly to COM3. It is. I'm just going to verify I still have that file open. I believe I do. And then I'm going to write to the radio again. And there we go. You should get this gibberish on the screen, but that means that it wrote correctly. We can close out of this, and then we're going to go to our programming software. We're going to open our saved file, the code plug file that I saved earlier from this radio, and I'm going to write this to the radio as well. At this point, this radio is essentially back to exactly the way it was from the factory. If I had a different code plug that I wanted to flash right here from settings I had when I was on stock, I could do that as well. But it's pretty much that easy to get back to stock. It's not hard, and there's not a lot of risk. And so have fun, enjoy it. Don't damage your radio by doing something stupid like transmitting on a frequency that your radio is not designed to transmit on. I know I've already said that, but just don't do it. See ya.